Laughter rolled like thunder inside the saloon, a rowdy chorus of harsh voices rising above the jangling piano and the clink of bottles. Cigarette smoke drifted in thick veils, stinging eyes and curling toward the rafters, where cobwebs sagged in dusty knots. Boots stamped against the warped floorboards, the row of card players slamming their hands down as another cheat was caught. Though the word cheat here was little more than an excuse to spill whiskey and flex knives. At the far end, the barkeep kept polishing glasses with a rag that had long since given up on being clean, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting trouble. The door opened. It did not crash wide like some hero's entrance, nor swing fast on a gust of bravado. No, it creaked, a slow groan of wood and iron hinges, barely audible above the clamor, but felt, somehow, in the marrow. For just an instant the laughter faltered, long enough for the piano man to glance up and strike a sour note. Then silence spread, rippling outward, until even the dice game halted mid-throw. The men stared toward the figure standing in the threshold. He was not what they expected. The man who stepped inside was old, older than anyone had guessed would dare walk into the Wolfclaw gang's den. His coat was long and black, worn to threads at the hem, dust clinging to every fold, as though he had carried half the desert upon his shoulders. A preacher's collar hugged his neck, faded and cracked, the white dulled to the color of ash. His frame bent slightly with age, a walking stick in one hand, a leather-bound Bible in the other. Lines carved deep into his face, but it wasn't weakness that made the room tense. It was the fire glinting in eyes that should have been dulled by years. He paused inside the door, letting the wind behind him sweep grit across the floorboards. His voice, when it came, trembled at first as though the words themselves cost him dearly. "Who took my wife's life?" The saloon seemed to inhale. Then came the laughter again, sharper this time, crueler. Chairs scraped, boots shifted, the gang rising from their games as if eager for sport. One outlaw with hair hanging in greasy strands leaned forward and slapped his knee. "Hear that, boys? Old man's lost his missus, and come in here like we're the church choir." He raised his whiskey and tossed it back, grinning through yellow teeth. Another, younger and meaner, slid his knife from his belt and spun it slow between his fingers. He stepped close enough for the lantern light to catch the scars tracing his jaw. "Mister, you sure you're in the right place? We deal in cards and whiskey here, not confessions." The blade winked in the lamplight, deliberate, as his smile widened. The barkeep froze mid-polish, then dropped his rag and busied himself behind the counter, not daring to look up again. He had seen where this would go. Every man in the room had. And still, the preacher did not move. His hand tightened on the Bible, fingers whitening against the cracked leather. The tremor in his voice faded, and the steel underneath began to cut through. "I've followed the trail near half a year. Every whisper in every town pointed me this way. Someone here." His gaze swept across the faces, holding each man with a force that felt heavier than a gun barrel. "Knows what happened on that trail south of Abilene." A hush clung to the air. One of the card players snorted and spat on the floor. "Plenty of folks die on trails, preacher. Bandits, fever, rattlesnakes. Ain't our concern." But the old man's eyes locked on him until the smirk faltered, then shifted to the outlaw with the knife, still dangling casually at his side. The silence deepened, broken only by the rattling of the storm against the shutters. Thunder cracked above, shaking dust from the rafters. The gang's leader, a tall figure with a wide-brimmed hat casting his face into shadow, finally stood from his table. He leaned against a post, arms crossed, and his voice rolled like velvet soaked in venom. "Now, preacher," he drawled, "you walk in here alone, asking questions that don't much concern us. A wise man might sit down, have a drink, and leave it at that. What kind of fool stands against 20 with nothing but a holy book?" Every eye returned to the old man, waiting. Would he falter? Would he lower his gaze and shuffle back into the storm? Or would he somehow draw fire from nothing but the word he carried? The preacher drew in a slow breath, steady despite the tremor in his frame. "The kind of fool," he said softly, "who still has something left worth fighting for." The piano man licked his lips and set his hands back on the keys, but dared not play. The knife-wielding outlaw leaned close enough that his breath fogged the preacher's cheek. "You'd best tell us why we shouldn't cut you down where you stand, old man." Lightning slashed across the windows, lighting the saloon in stark white for the blink of an eye. In that flash, the preacher's face seemed transformed, not feeble, not broken, but burning with a fury carved by grief. His knuckles clenched, not on a pistol, not on a blade, but on the edges of the Bible itself, as though the words inside might be loosed like arrows. "And now let me ask you, standing where you are, would you have stood your ground against 20 men, with nothing but a Bible in your hand?" The storm pressed harder against the saloon, rain beginning to lash the windows, wind whistling through the cracks. The outlaw's laughter faltered once more, because something in that question, unspoken yet somehow carried in the air, had shifted the ground beneath them. The old preacher did not break. He stood there, eyes fixed on theirs, waiting for the truth he had crossed deserts and rivers to find. The night outside was restless, but not half as restless as the silence that settled over the gang. Something was coming. They all felt it. Trouble had walked in wearing a preacher's coat, and whether or not he carried a weapon mattered less than the fire in his eyes. The storm outside rumbled like a restless beast, shaking the windows and their frames. Rain began to strike the roof in hard, scattered bursts, and the lanterns along the wall flickered, as though the very air inside the saloon carried the storm's temper. The preacher stood among them, shoulders stooped beneath the weight of years and grief, yet still unyielding, his gaze locked on the circle of faces tightening around him. A memory cut across his mind sharper than any blade. His wife's laugh in the morning sun, her hand brushing his as they walked the road south. Then the scream. Hooves pounding like thunder, shadows on the ridge, faceless riders blotting out the light. He remembered the gunfire, the dust choking his throat, her body falling in silence. When he closed his eyes, he still saw the trail stained with her blood. Since that day, the road had offered him no rest, no comfort, only whispers. A ring pond in one town, a saddle left behind in another, until every step drew him closer to the wolves now circling in this very room. One of the outlaws spat tobacco juice on the floor, grinning wide enough to split his face. "You hear that old crow croaking? Thinks we'll confess to murder, 'cause his bones are rattling." He tipped his chair back and laughed, the sound picked up by the others like a chorus of coyotes, sharp and cruel. The preacher did not answer. His silence seemed to enrage them more than his question. Another man, heavy-set with a scar slashing through his eyebrow, grabbed a bottle from the counter and tossed it toward him. Whiskey sloshed over his coat, the sharp sting of alcohol mixing with the smell of dust and smoke. "Drink up, preacher. You'll need it if you plan on outlasting us." The barkeep glanced up once, just once, then lowered his head quickly. His hands trembled as he reached for another bottle, though no one had ordered. The air had grown too charged, like the moment before lightning strikes a tree in open country. At the center of it all stood their leader, taller than the rest, lean as a whip, his hat brim casting a shadow that hid most of his expression, save for the curl of a smile at the corner of his mouth. His voice slid through the laughter like a blade hidden in velvet. "Tell me, preacher, you walk all this way, chasing phantoms. What makes you think you'll find answers in a place like this?" His eyes gleamed as he leaned forward. "Or is it revenge you're after?" The preacher's jaw tightened. He remembered the promises whispered over a grave, remembered the soil beneath his fingernails as he buried her alone, the wind carrying no words but his own vow. "I will find them." His lips parted, but before he could speak, a gunshot split the air. One of the younger outlaws had drawn his revolver and fired into the ceiling, laughing as plaster dust rained down. "Lord bless us!" he shouted. The holy man nearly jumped. He swung the pistol toward the preacher's chest, finger twitching on the trigger, eyes dancing with madness. "Maybe we ought to send you on to meet her, see if she's waiting." The saloon erupted again with laughter, chairs scraping back, boots thumping the floorboards. It wasn't mirth, not really. It was the laughter of men smelling weakness, of a pack circling prey until the first bite of blood. Every chuckle struck like a lash. Each grin cut deeper than any knife. The preacher stood still. His coat dripped with whiskey. His fingers clenched around the Bible so tightly the leather groaned. He raised his eyes, not to the boy with the pistol, not even to the silver-tongued leader, but to all of them at once, and for a heartbeat the storm outside seemed to hush, listening. "And now, friend, I put the question to you. If laughter turned toward you like a pack of wolves, could you keep from trembling?" The gang's guffaws echoed, a flicker of unease threaded beneath them. Something in the preacher's stillness unsettled the room. He had walked through towns where men warned him off, where sheriffs shook their heads, where mothers pulled children inside at the sight of his shadow. Yet he had not stopped. Every mile of dust, every night of prayer spoken into the void had brought him here. And now, in the teeth of the storm, in the stink of liquor and gunpowder, he knew he had finally found the men who had stolen her breath. The leader's grin lingered, but his eyes narrowed, calculating. He leaned his back against the post, speaking loud enough for the room to hear. "You've got grit, preacher, I'll give you that. But grit don't win against numbers." His hand rested lightly on the butt of his revolver. Not drawn yet, not needed. The others hooted and jeered, emboldened by his calm. Another outlaw snatched the preacher's walking stick and snapped it across his knee, tossing the splintered halves to the floor. "Look, boys, now he can't even hobble." The saloon shook with laughter again, fists pounding tables, boots stomping, the piano man slapping keys in a mock hymn. The preacher bent slowly, picked up one half of the stick, and held it in his hand, not as a crutch, not as a weapon, but as if the act itself was a reminder that nothing broken was beyond use, that even splinters could serve a purpose. He lifted his gaze, and in that moment the lantern flame guttered low, shadows clawing higher across the walls. Thunder boomed, closer now, rattling glasses on the shelves. The rain had turned to a downpour, hammering against the roof like war drums. The storm had found its rhythm, and inside the saloon, so had the men circling their prey. Still, the preacher did not falter. His grief had stripped him of fear long ago. Only one thing remained in him, an iron certainty that before the storm passed, truth would be forced into the open, whether by word or by blood. The lantern flames wavered in the draft, their light spilling unevenly across sweat-streaked faces. The gang pressed closer, their boots thudding in rhythm with the storm outside. The preacher's coat clung damp to his shoulders, still heavy with spilled whiskey. Yet he did not move from his place. His eyes wandered slowly over the men, each sneer and smirk, each pair of hands resting near holsters or playing with knives, until they landed on one detail that froze the air in his lungs. A ring. Silver, dulled by dirt and years of hard riding, but unmistakable. On the little finger of a wiry outlaw with a crooked smile glinted the same band his wife had worn since their wedding day. He remembered slipping it onto her hand beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, remembered her laugh when it was a size too big and slid down her knuckle. The sight of it now, hanging loose on another man's hand, was like a nail driven through his chest. His breath caught, though he hid it well. This was no accident. These were not mere drifters or laughing cowhands. These were the faceless riders he had followed across plains and rivers, across nights of cold firelight and days of blistering dust. 3 states, countless miles, and every whisper of rumor had led him here. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that surged inside his veins. The outlaw with the ring noticed his stare and raised his hand mockingly, turning it so the silver caught the light. "Pretty thing, ain't it? Took it off some woman on the trail, if I recall." He chuckled and tucked his hand back into his vest. "Didn't think it worth much, but maybe it's worth more than I knew." The others howled, their laughter jagged and cruel, but the preacher did not answer. He lowered his gaze to the Bible in his hand, not as if in defeat, but as if steadying himself, like a man bracing for recoil. Behind his stillness, memory uncoiled, not of sermons preached or hymns sung, but of war. Once, long before this bent frame and gray beard, he had worn Union blue. He had stood among cannon smoke and cries of dying men, a chaplain by title, but not by duty alone. He had carried scripture to comfort the wounded, but in his other hand he had carried a Colt revolver, because comfort without defense was nothing but a lie. He remembered the first time he had fired it, his voice still hoarse from reading psalms, his hand steady as he shot down a Confederate raider who had aimed for the stretcher-bearers. He had knelt in the mud afterward, not praying for forgiveness, but swearing he would never again mistake gentleness for weakness. That memory lived in him still, buried beneath years of preaching peace, but never gone. And now, staring at the ring on that outlaw's finger, it surged up like a river bursting a dam. The gang drew closer, sensing victory. One man slammed his fist against the table, sending cards scattering. Another jabbed a pistol barrel against the preacher's chest, grinning at the lack of flinch. "You gonna start praying for us, old man?" he jeered. The preacher lifted his eyes, and the calm there unsettled even the bravest among them. His face was carved in stone, but his gaze burned like coals buried under ash. "Who took her life?" he asked again, voice low, steady, carrying more weight than the thunder crashing overhead. The leader stepped forward at last, brushing dust from his coat, his grin still in place though his eyes had sharpened to slits. "Seems the good reverend thinks he's found the devils he's been chasing. Trouble is, preacher, devils ain't much for confessing, and they don't take kindly to questions." He tipped his hat back and gestured with a lazy hand. "Boys, maybe it's time we show this relic what happens when a man pokes too long at things better left buried." Chairs scraped. Boots shifted. The circle tightened. The shadows loomed on the walls, taller and darker as the lantern sputtered. The air smelled of sweat, whiskey, and the acrid tang of gunpowder still hanging from the shot fired earlier. Every sound magnified, the clink of spurs, the crack of knuckles, the preacher's slow, even breath. And yet he sat, unmoving. He lowered himself into a chair as if he had all the time in the world, resting the Bible on the table before him. The gang roared with laughter at the sight. "Look at him, sittin' like he's waiting for Sunday service," one shouted. Another tossed a coin at him, the metal ringing sharply before rolling to the floor. But he did not react. He folded his hands, eyes never leaving theirs, waiting. The leader leaned closer, his smile sharpening into a sneer. "What's your plan, preacher? Gonna stare us to death? Or you hopin' your God strikes us down with lightning from that storm?" Still the preacher waited. His patience unsettled them more than rage ever could. There was power in stillness, a kind of silence they could not laugh away. "And now, I ask you plain, would you have patience to wait, knowing the killer sat an arm's length away?" The storm hammered harder against the saloon, the wind howling through cracks in the walls. The piano man's fingers hovered uselessly above the keys, too nervous to play. The barkeep clutched a bottle, so tight it looked ready to shatter in his grip. The gang moved closer still, their circle shrinking. The outlaw with the ring tapped it against the edge of the table, smirking, daring the preacher to lunge. Another nudged the Bible with his pistol barrel, knocking it half an inch forward, testing for a reaction. The old man gave none. Inside, though, his heart beat steady as a drumline. Every detail imprinted, the ring on the outlaw's hand, the positions of their guns, the way the leader's thumb rested lazy near his holster. He remembered training young soldiers long ago, telling them the battle was not won by who shot first, but by who chose the moment best. That lesson burned in him now. He would not waste his chance on rashness, not when the truth sat right in front of him. He closed his eyes briefly, whispering words no one could hear, though perhaps his wife's spirit did. Then he opened them again, and the storm outside broke full upon the town, a great crack of thunder rattling the bottles on the shelves. The men laughed again, forcing courage through noise. But in the center of it all, the preacher sat calm, the fire in his gaze saying more than words ever could. He would wait. He would endure. And when the moment came, he would strike, not with desperation, but with judgment long prepared. Wind bucked against the batwing doors until they clattered like loose teeth, letting the night sniff into the room in sharp drafts. Voices gathered on the boardwalk, low, uncertain, the hush of a town that knows a story is about to turn ugly. A woman tugged a shawl tighter and peered in through a crack. A freckled boy stood on tiptoes and got yanked back by his father. And somewhere a dog barked once and fell silent, muzzle pressed to the rain-slicked boards as if the storm might swallow the sound. Across the street, the sheriff stepped out onto his office stoop with a lantern held high, studied the saloon a moment, then lowered the light and turned his eyes to the black river of the road, like a man reading a sign that wasn't there. He shifted his weight, breathed through his nose, and retreated without a word. The door to his office shut with a careful click that sounded like a prayer left unfinished. Inside, heat and liquor made the air thick, the lamps flaring and guttering as the storm shoved against the windows. The gang's shadows reached long and jagged up the walls, a gallery of heads and hats and hard shoulders, each ripple of flame bending them into taller, meaner shapes. The preacher felt the room constrict around him, the circle closing as surely as a noose. He smelled wet leather and skin, and the cold iron breath of gunmetal, all of it braided with the sweetness of spilled whiskey drying on his coat. He hadn't told them about the road south, not the way the morning had opened like a hymn, prairie bright as a brass buckle, larks springing from the grass, not the way her hand had rested light in the crook of his elbow. He kept that part, as he kept all tender things, under the ribs, where no one could bruise them more than grief already had. But the memory came anyway, unbidden and searing, the hooves cutting up the horizon, the silhouettes cresting the low hill, the way the air changed right before the first shot rang like a bell struck out of tune. He had knelt beside her in the dust while the riders thundered off laughing. He'd pressed his hand to the warmth leaving her and whispered something he could not remember now, though the sound of his voice on that road had never left him. He'd shoveled earth with his palms when the spade slipped from his grip, the dirt clogging his nails, the grave a shallow wound in hard ground. He'd laid her ring on the mound because he could not bear to slip it free without the grace of her own fingers gifting it. When he looked up for help, he found no one but his own shadow in the sky, and so he gave his vow to the wind because the wind was all that would carry it. I will follow you across every mile this country holds, and when I find you, you will answer. The promise had not needed to be loud to be binding. He felt it now as a weight and a weapon. The leader scraped a chair back with a leisurely squeal and sat, boot heels planted wide, as if he were propping up the room. He poured himself a finger of whiskey and considered the old man, like a rancher considering a stray bull nearing his fence. The brim of his hat threw his eyes into shadow, but his mouth moved with easy humor. "You know," he said, rolling the liquor across his tongue, "a road's a dangerous place. Lots of folks learn it the hard way. Maybe even a preacher's woman." He let the last two words dangle like a lure on a line. The sound in the room thinned. Even his men felt it, the tug toward something meaner than sport. The one with the silver ring tapped it against his glass, a tiny bell that cut through the thunder. The preacher didn't blink. He watched the leader's hand swirl in lazy circles above the rim of his cup, watched the way his thumb brushed the etched glass, an idle man's grace. "Speak plain," the old man said. His voice came quiet and even, yet the barkeep flinched as if it had been a slap. "Plain." The leader's grin widened. "Plain's this. We were riding south late spring. Caught a couple on the road. Didn't plan it. They were just there. Wrong day to be alive." He shrugged as if describing weather. "Boy took a shine to a ring. Pretty thing. Stopped to admire the work. Woman got bold, bit him senseless. That made it messy." He lifted the glass and drank, Adam's apples sliding beneath his stubble. "Happens fast, preacher. Dust, noise, spooked horses. Folks die." The laugh that followed was almost gentle, almost kind, as if he could teach a lesson about the world and be thanked for it. His men chuckled with him, relief steaming out of them. They had wanted permission to be proud. Lightning split the night like a white blade, the flash driving through the windows and peeling the saloon into stark pieces, bar, faces, pistols, cards flung and forgotten. For the heartbeat that everything was bright. The preacher saw each of them carved out of darkness, as if by the hand of a merciless sculptor. When the light fell, the afterimage hung before his eyes, a gallery of the condemned. He breathed once. In. Out. The Bible lay where he had placed it, cover slick with whiskey, pages swelling at the edges. He had spoken 1,000 sermons over that book, words meant to bind wounds and call men home from the edges of their worst impulses. Tonight it lay like a ledger waiting on signatures. The leader cocked his head, studying him. "You carry anything else in that coat, Reverend? Or is your plan to drown us in verse?" He smiled. "I admire devotion. A man who keeps a promise as long as you have. Well, he earns a certain respect. The word respect struck like gravel. The preacher found the ring again, the small theft, shining like a nailhead. The outlaw, wearing it, saw the glance, lifted his hand with a flourish, and blew across the silver as though polishing it with breath. "This what brought you all that way?" he asked. "Shame if you came for nothing. Would have saved you miles." A murmur swelled outside the door. Someone tried the batwing slats, then thought better. The town pressed up against its own courage and felt it give. The sheriff's window stayed dark. In the stillness that followed, the preacher found the place inside himself where resolve lived, a country as quiet and terrible as ice. He had failed her on that road, failed to see the dust quicken in the distance soon enough, failed to get her behind the cottonwood, failed to stand between laughter and the fragile throat of a good woman. The failure had not lessened with time. It had sharpened, ground to an edge by every mile, until it could cut again if mishandled. He had learned to carry it like a blade wrapped in cloth. Now, with the cloth slipping, he felt its cold. He lifted his hands from the table with care, palms open a breath above the wood, as if smoothing a rumpled sheet. His voice, when it came, had the stillness of a pond under a black sky. "Say her name," he told the leader. "Say you remember it." The leader laughed softly. "Names don't stick. Faces neither. Just moments. The way a man's mouth opens when he understands. The way a woman reaches out and there's nothing there to catch. That's what I remember." A coarse cheer rattled the ceiling. The boy with the pistol who'd fired earlier slapped the bar and called for another round. The piano man hit 2 notes and lost both, his fingers too stiff to chase melody. The room held its breath the way a canyon does before a rockfall. The gang shifted, boots whispering, chairs angling, hands finding the curve of steel like men reaching for familiar lies. The preacher rose without hurry, the joints of his knees clicking softly, coat hanging from his shoulders like wet canvas. He lifted one side of it, and the lantern light slid along old walnut grips and blued metal polished by 1,000 careful cloths. Nestled beside the Bible, the Colt looked like a second kind of scripture, less for words than for answers. A soft ripple of jeers broke the hush, the young gun with the ceiling shot earlier barking a laugh. "Look at that relic. Gonna preach bullets, are you?" The outlaw with the silver ring tapped it against his glass again. Tink, tink, grinning wide enough to show every lie he'd ever told. The leader's smile cut thin. "Now that's a surprise," he drawled, tilting his head as if admiring a painting. "You come to church as proper, Reverend? Or just write your own last rites?" The preacher's thumb found the Colt's hammer like it had never forgotten the path. He set the Bible on the table with a gentleness that made mockery feel smaller than it had a moment before. "This book remembers," he said. "So does this." The young gun jerked his pistol up, eager hands outrunning sense. Thunder cracked, rattling the glasses. The preacher's first shot answered before the echo died, and the boy folded as if someone had plucked his spine. The ringed outlaw's grin vanished. His glass leapt in his hand. The ring pinged off the rim and spun, silver singing across the table before dropping and rolling toward the spittoon with a bright, false cheer. Everything erupted at once. The piano exploded into a handful of terrified notes, then silence as the keys took a bullet and jumped. Lantern light flared as a second lamp burst, oil licking across the bar in a brief tongue of fire before rain wormed through the roof seam and doused it with a hiss. Men shouted. Chairs toppled. The barkeep dove, arms over his head, as bottles behind him burst in a glitter storm and whiskey fogged the air. The preacher stepped sideways into the thunder of it and felt the old training open in him like a map he knew from walking, not from reading. Breath steady. Front sight. Press. Follow through. He moved with the measured economy of a man who learned long ago how to keep others alive by killing quickly. The second shot took a shoulder and spun a man backward into a table. The third smacked a pistol out of a hand before that hand could find a trigger. The fourth cracked through a mirror and hit the flanker he'd watched in the glass a split second before the man cleared leather. Powder smoke boiled up from the Colt and threaded with the storm-laced air until the saloon smelled like a battlefield, and a barn fire had shared a secret. Down. The preacher barked, and the barkeep vanished like a spooked rabbit. The old man slid behind an overturned table as two slugs chewed splinters out of its edge at throat height, the wood kicking him with every hit. He popped up, fired once, front sight press, and the Scarborough brute dropped his gun and clutched his arm, staggering into the stringless piano with a clatter like bones in a sack. He took a round along the upper arm, a hot line that scored flesh and sent a quick lightning of pain down to the fingertips. He let it be a bell, felt its ring, and then set it aside. There would be time for trembling if the night gave it. He pivoted left, breath like a metronome, gave the boy with the greedy eyes a shot in the thigh that folded him hard, gave the man who was coming straight over the table a clean halt with a slug that hit center and laid him out flat as a closed book. 6. The Colt went light. He counted it the way a man counts steps on a long climb, without congratulating himself for any of them. He rolled behind the bar, while two men fired wild through smoke, the shots hammering wood and glass, but finding nothing that bled. Empty cases clicked like coins on the floor as he punched them from the cylinder with his thumbnail, and let gravity do the rest. The storm roared. His breath rode it. He fed the revolver new brass with a quiet that would have sounded like prayer if prayer had clicks for syllables. The leader's voice cut through, slick with anger now. He ain't got forever, boys. Put him down. But fear had crept into the edges of bravado, and it made their aim shake, their timing slip. The preacher rose in a fountain of glass and fired through the veil of falling shards. One man spun and hit the bar. Another's hat went skyward as his legs forgot how to be legs. Smoke wrapped the room in a shawl. Sparks glowed in the haze, and then winked out. The window by the door took a stray bullet and vomited rain. The wind drove it in like cold needles. The ringed outlaw crawled for the back door, hand scrabbling at floorboards slick with spilled liquor. The preacher tracked him by the rattling of spurs and the quick flash of that silver thrumming along the floor like a wicked compass. He fired low, concise, and the man cried out and slumped, ring hand splayed. The band itself had skittered on and now lay spinning, thin music at the edge of the chaos. The preacher never took his eyes off the hand as the ring wobbled, slowed, and toppled in a tiny hush beside the spittoon. The sound marked a place inside him, quiet and terrible. He holstered it for later, when the counting was done. He caught movement by the stairs and put a round into the post by reflex. A man behind it gave up his courage all at once and ran for the door, hands high, the storm swallowing him with no promises. Another lunged from the right, a knife out and noisy with the need to be a hero. The preacher let the man's momentum carry him into a chair and stopped him with the quickest path he knew. A muzzle flash, a shove, a boot to send the knife skittering. The chair toppled. The room breathed. The Colt spoke again, and the last of the side hitters went down in a crash of bottle and oak. The leader had not moved from his post. Smoke curled around him, made a false ghost of his long coat. He had the patience of a snake, waiting for the right angle, the one true strike. The preacher felt him the way a man feels a rattler before he sees it, the charged stillness that hums in the bones. He reloaded 3 cartridges by touch, and let the hammer down hard enough to promise the rest. "Reverend," the leader called, soft again, the velvet creeping back over the blade of his voice. "You think this ends with you upright? You think the world lets an old man shoot a room full of fellows and walk away like a sunrise?" The preacher answered the only way the night understood, by stepping into the open. It wasn't foolishness. It was weight placed where it needed to be. He stood among the wreckage, tables on their backs like overturned turtles, glass crunching under his boots, rain quilting the floor in wet patches that reflected the wild lantern light. The Colt hung easy in his hand, barrel low, muzzle steaming faintly in the draft. The leader slid out of the smoke with his gun leveled, stance perfect, eyes bright under the brim. They measured each other across a distance, so small it could have been bridged by a handshake on another day. The room hushed to a hard silence. Even the storm seemed to lean in. Smoke clung to the rafters like ghosts unwilling to leave. The saloon was silent now, save for the soft hiss of a broken lantern bleeding out its last flame. Tables lay on their sides like toppled gravestones. Cards scattered across the floorboards as if chance itself had fled the room. Men who had laughed loudest only minutes before lay still, their boots twisted awkwardly, hats rolling loose, pistols slack in their fingers. The storm's breath pushed through the cracked shutters, stirring dust and smoke into faint spirals that vanished before the eye could follow them. In the middle of it all stood the preacher. His coat hung in tatters, one sleeve torn open where blood seeped slow and dark. The Colt still smoked faintly at his side, but his other hand cradled the Bible as though it were both shield and anchor. His face looked carved by the night. Hard lines deepened, eyes shadowed, jaw tight. He did not look triumphant. He did not look broken. He simply looked like a man who had carried his vow to its final word. He moved among the fallen, slow as though the air itself weighed him down. The silver ring gleamed briefly in his pocket when his coat shifted, a small glint of memory, carried like a heartbeat. He paused at the center of the ruin, lowered his head, and whispered, not to the survivors moaning softly at the edges, not to the town pressing outside the doors, but to the silence that had replaced her voice. "You mocked the Lord's word," he said, each syllable quiet, but heavier than any bullet fired that night. "Tonight, you met his judgment." The wind caught the words and carried them through the broken saloon doors, spilling them onto the boardwalk, where townsfolk huddled with wide eyes. A boy pressed into his mother's skirt, an old rancher leaned hard on his cane, and the sheriff, pale and useless, looked down at his boots as though he might find courage in the mud. None stepped forward. None spoke. They only watched as the old preacher adjusted the weight of his coat, holstered the revolver, and lifted the Bible close to his chest. He did not stay to explain, nor did he claim victory. He did not call for witnesses or beg forgiveness. He simply turned, boots grinding through glass and blood, and pushed through the doors. The storm met him like an old companion, rain slanting across his shoulders, lightning stitching ragged lines above the rooftops. His figure blurred almost at once into the wet black of the night. Some swore they saw him vanish down the road. Others claimed he melted straight into the storm itself. Whatever the truth, when dawn came, the preacher was gone, leaving only the wreckage behind as proof that he had ever walked there. The town carried the story long after, in whispers at poker tables, in sermons spoken too carefully, in the hush that fell each time thunder rolled over the plains. They called him a ghost, a soldier turned saint, a man who had traded sermons for vengeance. Some said the Lord himself had sent him. Others muttered he was nothing more than grief and fury given skin. And now the question passes to you, as it has to every soul who hears this tale. Was it holy justice that strode through those doors, Bible in one hand and death in the other? Or was it vengeance, wearing a preacher's face?